Hi, I'm Derrick Jensen. This is Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network. My guest today is Joan Maloof, Professor Emeritus of Biology and Environmental Studies at Salisbury University. She founded the Old Growth Forest Network to preserve, protect, and promote the country's few remaining stands of old-growth forest. She spends her time lecturing, writing, visiting forests, assisting private landowners, and supporting local groups trying to protect community forests from development. She's the author of 4 books about trees and forests. So first off, thank you for your work in the world, and second, thank you for being on the program.
Thank you, Derek.
So, should we start with would you rather start with how you got into this work, or would you rather start with a definition of old growth? Or would you rather start with a definition of forests?
I would rather start with how I got into this work.
Okay.
That's much easier. The others don't have a real clear common definition of old growth. So, how I got into this work, there's the story about the turtle and the hare. Well, I'm definitely the turtle type. It's been a slow and steady progress for me. I was born loving plants. I don't know why. I don't know where that came from, but from the time I could crawl, I was looking at all the little plants on the suburban lawn. And when it was time to play, I was out in the creek in the forest, and as a young woman, and climbing trees and camping out and loving the forest, but I had no idea the names of anything or the science behind what I was seeing. I was just kind of developing that love for the place. And then as I got older, I learned the textbook stuff, the sciencey stuff. I became a scientist, studied plant science and botany, and went to University of Delaware and was a plant science major. But interestingly enough, I graduated knowing all about the names of the little parts, but without really being able to identify anything. And then from there, I started learning about the native plants and started learning how to identify them, and actually was hired by our local heritage program to look for rare and endangered plant species in Maryland. So I really gained an appreciation for the individual organisms and just the rare surprise when you find something that you don't expect, or the beauty of the forest. And then I continued my education with a master's in environmental science, and learned all about what we're doing to the water, what we're doing to the air, kind of bringing that all in together, and the way that the plants on the planet clean both our water and our air, and what happens when we don't honor them and clear them away. And I started teaching after that, teaching biology and teaching the textbook work. But then it was time for a PhD, because the teaching was going so well that I thought, I like this kind of work. I enjoy being an educator. It's time for the PhD. But for my PhD, I branched out further. It's like, I've been studying the plants for a long time now. Let's get some animals into the mix. And for that ecology degree, then I specialized in plant-animal interactions. And I did my research at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab in Colorado, and I put the cherry on the top of my scientific work, if you will. Learned how to write all the scientific papers and read all the scientific papers and do the hypotheses and do the statistical analysis. And when all that was done and I came back to my Maryland home with this shiny new PhD degree, I said, okay, where am I going to study the interactions of plants and animals near my home university. And I started looking around, and there was nothing like the wildflower meadows of Colorado where everything was working as nature evolved it. Instead, I was looking at hedgerows and farm fields and strips along roads, and it just seemed like everything was so disturbed. And the place that was the most natural were the forests and the second growth forests, so the older forests. I looked around, there was no old growth left where I live, but there were some older forests where the trees were about 100 years old. And that's where I could really feel nature at work, and all these interactions happening between the plants and the animals. But at the same time that I was really recognizing the importance of these forests, both for habitat and for the human environment, I realized that they were coming down, these second growth forests, and they were being replaced with pine plantations in the area where I live. And as an ecologist then, I knew that we were losing so many species in this conversion from a mixed native forest to a pine plantation. E.O. Wilson says we lose 90% of the species in a forest when we convert it to a pine plantation. And at that same time, I was reading some books that really influenced me, one of them being your book, Derrick, Strangely at War. Remember that one?
Yeah.
That really influenced me, although it was a global look at what we were doing to our forests. And it really is like we were in a war against them, trying to cut them as fast as we can. And you opened my eyes to the fact that the stories I had been told about, oh, don't worry, you can cut the forest, but the forest will heal, it'll come back, it's a sustainable resource. You were the first place where I realized that that's not necessarily the truth, and that we have no proof that these forests that are being cut now will ever return in any way or shape like they have been. So that really moved me, and I wanted to do what I could to prevent any more conversion of these native forests to plantations. And I wanted to let some of these forests hopefully become old growth again someday. That was going to take a very long time, but hey, these forests had a little bit of age on them already, and couldn't we, some of them at least, set aside and preserve? So that's what was going through my mind and my heart while I was this scientist, university professor type. And I thought, well, how can I save these forests? And the only way at that point that I knew really to be an activist was through the science. And I thought, I know, I'll do a scientific study that'll show what we lose when we cut these forests. What organism am I going to use? And I was thinking, I could do moss species, and I could show how the moss species decline and disappear when we cut the forest and convert it. And I thought, well, or I could do spiders, or I could do snails. So there were all these organisms, and I was thinking, which one should I pick to do this research project? And of course, anyone I picked, I was going to have to spend at least a year becoming a specialist in that organism, and then I was going to have to plan a nice scientific study and carry it out, which would take another couple of years and get it published. And then I realized that even if I did all that, let's say it's going to take me 3 years, and if I'm lucky, I'll get a nice paper in a good journal like Nature or Science. Will that save any of those forests? And I realized probably not, right? Those studies have already been done. They've been done, and they're just sitting in journals. It used to be in the library, I would say, but now, in our internet out there, those studies have been done showing that this cutting is not a good thing for biodiversity or anything else. And at that point, I said, okay, well, what do I do now? And my answer was to take those studies out of their hiding, if you will, out of their specialized places and bring them out where the average person, the average reader could read them. That didn't have all that specialized science information or access to those specialized journals. And I had been writing for fun, writing essays and writing poetry, and I thought, okay, I will write the story of the forest in a way that maybe people could understand these interactions and what we lose when we cut the forest. And not just the average person, but the foresters too. I really wanted them to understand. So I decided to take a pause from my science and write a book for a general audience. And that was my book called Teaching the Trees, Lessons from the Forest, which came out in 2005. And it's funny, I named it that, Teaching the Trees, because I wanted it to count toward my tenure. So I had to kind of play it in that way. And I published it through a university press. And in that book, I really told the natural history stories about when we lose a particular species in the forest, when we cut a particular tree species, we lose all the rest of the species that go with it. So when we cut the beech trees, we lose the beech drops, which are a parasitic plant that depend on the beech trees. When we cut the holly trees, we lose the holly leaf miner. When we lose the holly leaf miner, we lose the parasites that live off the holly leaf miner larvae. And we lose the birds that live on the flies and the parasites and the ones that eat the berries. And the stories just go on and on and on like that. So I was telling some of those stories. And what happened next in that I decided that I wanted to visit an old growth forest for that book. And I've always been curious about these places that had never been cut, right? That's what an old growth forest is. That's my simple definition. Never logged. And when I asked around about old growth in the East, I would get conflicting stories. People would tell me sometimes, oh, there's nothing left whatsoever in the East. And I thought, well, that's a bummer. And other people would say, oh, yeah, there's lots of it around. But I could never really put my finger on where it was. So for the book Teaching the Trees, I dug a little deeper and found that there was a little tiny patch of old growth forest about 60 miles away from where I lived. And so one day I hopped in the car and I rode out there and I got out of my car and I started walking and I started breathing. And the air just felt different to me. in that place. Even though it was only 14 acres, it was still on the Delmarva Peninsula where I live, so it's flat land, but to me it smelled like the mountains. And I'd never experienced that sort of air on the flat peninsula where I live. And I started then researching when I went home, what is in the air in the forest? You know, even as a university professor with a PhD, I'd never heard anything about that. And my research then led me to find out that there were all these compounds that are given off not only by the leaves of the trees, but also by the fungus in the soil, and also the very breath of the salamanders, if you will. Everything in that forest is giving off compounds. And those chemicals, in a positive way, can go into our bloodstreams just the same way that the oxygen goes into our bloodstreams. And those chemicals can not only improve our health, but can affect our very moods. So it's like we can fall in love with the forest by walking through the forest and breathing this forest air. And my research, I dug deeper, and I found out that there were people in Japan that were studying this forest air bathing, and they called it Shinrin-yoku. And Derrick, it's interesting because I wrote about that research in my book, Teaching the Trees. It was the first time I'd ever heard about it. And since that time, it has been something that's entered our popular lexicon. So many people now know about wood air bathing and forest air bathing in Shinrin-yoku that was not even heard of before then. Have you heard of it?
I haven't heard of it, but this makes me think of, I haven't heard the Japanese name, but forest air bathing I have. And, it makes me think that whenever I would go on tour, I would, I live in a forest and I don't normally notice the smell, honestly, but then every time I would go on tour, when I would come home and, there's a 3/8 of a mile walk from where I would park to my house, and every time, two things. One is, having been away for a few days, I would notice how wonderful the forest smells as soon as I got out. And then the other is that there was a place about, if it's 3/8 of a mile for the whole walk, there's a place about a quarter mile in, so 1/8 of a mile left of my house, where every time I would suddenly feel like I was at home. And it never occurred to me. I always thought it was a visual. It's like I'm going through the forest and I get to this one place and the image I see would suddenly make me feel at home. But with you talking about this, it makes me suddenly realize that I'll bet it took a half hour for the smells to get into my bloodstream and kind of like if somebody smokes a joint, it takes a few seconds, it takes a little while. So it would take, if we presume I'm walking at a regular speed, maybe that's 10 minutes for it to, for me to first have breathed the forest air.
Right.
And for it to have made its way throughout my body. So thank you for that. I never thought of that before, but I think that's absolutely it, that was the feeling of home.
Yeah. And into your brain, how beautiful. And you'll notice it more and more now. And especially when you go, the older the forest is, I think the stronger the reaction is. So that was the first chapter in my book, Teaching the Trees. It was called Old Growth Air. And I got the same question over and over again from my readers, and they all wanted to know where the forest was. So I realized that there was this hunger in people to experience that, or maybe they've experienced somewhere before and they want to feel it again. And they approached the question like it was a big secret. They'd say, I won't tell anybody, can you please tell me where the forest is? I got the question so many times that I decided that I had to write another book that would tell people exactly how to get to these old growth forests in the East. Because everybody knows how to get on a plane and go to California and get to your woods. In my audiences, I have a lot of people that have done that, but hardly anybody that has experienced the eastern old growth forest. So I wanted to bring that to people's attention, that even though there's only 1% of the eastern forests left that are unlogged, and in many states, less than 0.1% left, but there are these small patches or places where you can experience the original forest of the East. So that book is called Among the Ancients, visiting one old growth forest in each of the 26 eastern states. It took me a couple years because I was teaching and I had to wait till spring break, or I'd do a few at a time and then come home. And what happened during those journeys, well, for one, I learned truly what old growth forest looks like. I learned how to recognize it, which you can read all the books you want about it, but experiencing it is something else. So I've learned to recognize the old growth, and I just really appreciated the beauty of the old growth forests. Time after time, when I'd leave a forest, I'd say, okay, well, what did I experience there? And it was like, oh, it was so beautiful. And I also came to the realization that these places are so rare that the average child is never going to see one of these places in the East. They'll grow up never knowing what the land here could be, what it is when it's left to itself. And it was, I think I was in New Hampshire, and I was thinking, what can we do to save the forests that are left? And what can we do to save some that are second growth and are getting ready to be cut yet again so that they can mature? And I realized that we needed an organization to do that. And I couldn't think of one that was specifically focused on saving the old growth forests in this nation. And I thought, okay, an organization that saves forests, the old growth forests, and lets some forests recover. But how are we going to quantify what we do? How are we going to make sure that every child can get to a preserved forest and watch it get older and older? And being the scientist that I am, I thought, well, we can quantify it by making sure that there's at least one forest in each county that's preserved from logging and open to the public and relatively accessible. And if we have one in each county, then no child will be very far away from one of these forests. They won't have to drive 200 miles to get to one. Even though it's not old growth, they can visit a forest in their community that's old and preserved. And that was the moment I think I went from, in my mind, being an academic and a writer to being someone who's running a nonprofit organization. Because when I got home told my husband, okay, I know what my next life work is going to be. You know, we're going to start this organization that's going to make sure that there's one forest in each county preserved from logging, and it'll be called the Old Growth Forest Network.
So, there's a couple directions possibly to go. One of them is for you to tell me about the Old Growth Forest Network. But another direction, I'm wondering if two other possible directions. One of them is I'm wondering if you could talk about just a few more of the animal-plant interactions. And like one I always think about is when the wolves came back to Yellowstone, then that improved fish habitat, which you wouldn't think they'd have anything to do with it, but by forcing by the carnivores forcing the herbivores to run around, they weren't able to sort of hang out and be lazy near the stream bed and not eat as much. So reintroduction of wolves helped make it so there's more aspens grow on stream banks, which made it so that there are more fish. So can you talk about a couple of those interactions? That's one possibility. Old Growth Forest Network is another possibility. And the third possibility is, you know, I've visited the Deep South a couple times, and there's a part of me that just is, if I lived 100 times, I think one of them or two of them I would like to live in the Deep South, just because I love the sound of all the insects and I love all the greenness. So I was wondering if, just for me, having not lived there, if you could give a brief description of a Deep South old growth forest, whether it's Mississippi or Alabama. So any of those three directions.
Oh, wow. So fun. They all sound so fun. Okay. Let's talk about Sipsey Wilderness in Alabama. That's the first chapter in my second book, Among the Ancients, where I visited the old growth, because I did my research. Okay, where's a patch of old growth left in Alabama? And I heard tell of this place in Sipsey Wilderness where there was this giant tulip poplar tree, like 4 miles in. And, so you have to find this place, and you have to park your car, and you got to put on your backpack, and all that you have to do for a journey, your food and water, and then is your car locked? Is it going to be broken into at this trailhead where there's nothing? There's all that typical worry, and then you start down the trail, and it's just like you said, Derrick, it's like, you start breathing, you start walking, and then finally you get into the rhythm, and then you're really feeling the forest, and you're looking around, and you're seeing the moss species, and you're seeing the trees, and now I'm hiking and crossing the stream, and it's like, am I ever going to find this one giant tree in the midst of all these trees that's supposed to be here 4 miles in? And hiking and wondering and experiencing the sounds of the cicada, maybe if it's late summer, and the birds. And if you go by yourself, there's not a lot of chit chat, so you'll hear a lot more animal sounds. And then I was stopped in my tracks because there it was. It was this enormous tree in the center of this, like a circular canyon almost. They call it a box canyon, but it was circular shape, and there's water dripping from the walls. And where the water dripped, there were these unusual plant species called saxifrage. And on the ceiling of the wall, the highest level of the wall, other trees were growing up there. So I think this big tulip poplar, it had plenty of moisture for its roots, and it was trying to outcompete those other trees along the canyon walls, and there was this just beauty, many hundreds of years old, and the bark changes on trees when they get that old. It's like a balding bark, and I was the only one there, and I was so enraptured, I just decided that I just had to sleep in that canyon for the night. And I put down my pad, and I, was very careful not to trample in there because it wasn't really an official camping ground. I knew to be very careful with the plants. But then as I was drifting off to sleep, an owl came in and landed on one of the trees nearby, and just the sound echoing off the walls. So I'm a scientist, right? But that is poetry and beauty, and we need the forest for that too. And if it had not been an old growth forest, you would not have as many standing dead trees with cavities in them, little holes. And if you didn't have holes in the trees, you wouldn't have the flying squirrels. And if you didn't have the flying squirrels, you might not have the owl. And those are some of the interactions. If that forest had been cut out and had become, Peachtree Plaza, the next shopping center, we wouldn't have that heart experience. We wouldn't have the sound of the insects. We wouldn't have the sound of the owl. We wouldn't have, the flying squirrels. 80% of terrestrial biodiversity is contained in the forest. So when we remove those forests, we're losing that biodiversity. So another story, I'll just tell another little story, because the standing trees are one thing, but in the old growth forest, there's a lot of dead trees that are down, what scientists call coarse woody debris. And if you're not really familiar with forest ecology, you'll see these dead trees and think, oh, what a shame. Oh, that tree got blown over in a windstorm, or a fungus got it and it died. But once you dive into forest ecology, when you see those big old dead trees, well, it actually kind of makes me happy. Because for one, I know that that tree grew long enough to get big and old and die of natural causes. And two, that tree on the forest floor is home to more life than it was when it was standing. So one of the things that finds these dead trees is something called a best beetle. They're big and they're black, and they look like patent leather beetle is one of their nicknames, because they're about an inch long. And these beetles feed on the dead wood. They'll never feed on a live tree. And they live in pairs, in like married couples, if you will. They're a male and a female, and they actually eat the dead wood, and then they excrete it as their frass, is a polite way of saying their poop. But once that poop comes out of them, that dead tree frass, it's got more moisture and more nutrients, so now it can actually grow more bacteria and fungus on it, and then the beetles will re-ingest that. And then it's more nutritious to them. So it's kind of like animals that have two stomachs, except they let the digestion happen outside. And because of the cavities that they create all through this dead wood, they're letting more moisture get in there. They're letting more fungal species get in there. And because of the fungi, more insect species will go in there to feed on the fungi, then more salamanders, more lizards, more snakes. and you have a very complex ecosystem right around that big old dead log. Now, a twig is not going to give you an ecosystem like that. You need to have large logs that will stay warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer and stay damper longer to have all those life forms. That's just a little teaser.
No, I love that. And one of the things I'm thinking is that the forest here where I live was cut probably in the 70s, and I moved here in 99, and one of the joys of the past 20 years has been I haven't done anything with it. It's just, one of the joys has been to watch the dog hair, they call it, start to thin out a little bit. And, and there's some big trees have fallen. There was 3, I mean, they're still young. They're only 40 years old, but it's been pretty cool. This last winter in windstorms, there were 3 different big trees fell over, and every time I felt sorry. It's like, I feel bad for that particular tree, but then I think, yay, more woody debris. That's what the forest needs, is more of these dead trees.
Exactly, and those nutrients are going back into the soil, and they're feeding the other standing living trees. Yeah, the older it gets, the more beautiful and the more biodiverse. Yeah, the foresters will say, oh, you have to thin the trees so when they come back too close together, but they will thin themselves out. And if you let it happen naturally, then the trees that are left standing are going to be the ones that are most genetically adapted to the site and physiologically adapted to the site. You know, if we come in there and start thinning, we don't know, we might be thinning out a tree that could live to be 500 years. So I think it's much better to let the forest thin itself out.
Yeah, and also I think I've talked to George Werthner about this a few times, that it ends up, if you do really sort of intense analysis of it, it ends up that in a forest that even in a native forest that it might have many of a certain species, there will be individuals among that species who are resistant to certain sorts of beetles, and others who instead are resistant to drought. It's just like with humans, that it makes sense to have a diverse genetic pool even within one species, so that if there is some, plague comes through, then some will survive it, and if there's a different plague, others will survive it.
That's exactly what's happening right now with the emerald ash borer, which is an insect that's devastating to the ash trees in the east and Midwest. It was first noticed in this country in Michigan, and it's been spreading out from there, and it's up in Maine and a little bit up into Canada now. Well, it's killing almost all the ash trees in its path, but they're finding these tiny little islands of resistant trees. And so what once became something that could have wiped out all of the ash trees, now we say, oh, for some reason these are resistant, so we could take cuttings from those trees to have resistant ash. But just think, if that had been if those pockets, instead of remaining forest, had been turned into freeways, then we wouldn't have that resistance. So, yeah.
So we have 7 or 8 minutes left, and can you introduce your organization a bit more and talk about what the organization does? And another question, oh God, we should talk again sometime. Another question is, okay, before we get to the organization, I want to talk about the transition that takes place from second growth forest to slightly older forest to slightly older forest to old growth. What is that? If you're hoping to protect some places that aren't necessarily old growth right now, what will be that process? And then after that, talk about your organization.
The process is a slow recovery. It's the tree species will change slightly over time. depending on where you are. So in every place, there's the early successional species that like the full sun. Place where I am right now, you're going to have pines and cherries that come in first. And then eventually, after the soil builds up, then you will have maples and then oak trees. And then the beech trees will come in. The trees that can grow in the shade. So first are the full sun dependent species. And then once that canopy is intact and the soil gets richer and richer, other species will come in. But then what happens over time, because it's like a shifting mosaic, I want to say. So some of those early successional species will stay there and survive while the later successional species come in. So what I see is a real mix of species in the very oldest forest that you don't have in the younger forests. Lots of times there's an attitude of, some species is going to take over if you let it. No, I see more diversity in the older forests. But let's talk about the old growth forest network too, because if we don't leave some of these second growth forests alone, we won't see this natural transition and increase in biodiversity. So the organization, once I didn't start it immediately when I had the idea. I taught for a few more years, and then my husband passed away, and it was 2011 where I said, okay, this is time. And I retired early from my teaching position and just gave it my all, and got the board like you do to make a 501c3 because I knew I was going to need some financial help to do this. And we've had wonderful donors that have helped to support the work. And now we have volunteers in many counties, county coordinators we call them, in 250 of the counties. And what they're doing is looking around their county for the best example of an old growth or older forest that's open to the public. And then we try to work with them to make sure that forest is firmly protected from logging. And if all that comes together, then we dedicate it into this old growth forest network. And so far we have 105 forests that have been dedicated in 23 different states. And anyone can go on our website, oldgrowthforest.net, and see where those forests are. So if you're planning a trip somewhere and you want to know, where's the highest quality forest in Florida or in Pennsylvania or in California, you can find many of these forests on our website. But in addition to growing this network, which when it's finished will be over 2,400 forests. I don't know if I'll live to see that, but we're making some good progress. We're building this forest network so people can see these forests and understand them, and also to provide habitat for the species that need it. But at the same time, Derrick, we're creating this network of people who care about the forest. And that's been one of the most surprising and interesting things to me, is just this wonderful community of people who care about the forest. So even though there can be bad news about politics or epidemics or whatever it is, I see this community of people that are really caring about the forest and really speaking for them and working for them, and that, is beautiful.
So let's say that somebody in two different questions. Let's say somebody in a state that already has people working on this, or in a county that already has people working on this. Mm-hmm. How can they help? Or how about, it looks like on your website, it looks like you have nobody in New Mexico. So both circumstances, if there's already somebody in your county, how can somebody help? And if there's not somebody in your county or state, how can they get started?
Thank you. Yeah, on the website, it'll tell you where the county coordinators are. And if there's already a forest dedicated in your county, you can help by donating, because that helps. You can also help by, maybe you're associated with a different place. You know, maybe you go to Maine for the summer and there's a forest that you really care about there, and you can also volunteer to be a county coordinator in a place where you don't necessarily live, but you explore and go to the forest. And there's many, many opportunities to be county coordinators left. We'd like to get in all the states as quickly as possible. As I said, we're only in 23. So yeah, New Mexico, come on, Washington. We just had our first Oregon dedication last summer. We have quite a few in California already, but I'd like to get more forests in the Midwest. And I also do a lot of speaking. So often that's how we grow the network somewhere. So for instance, I could be invited to give a talk in Missouri, and then we get more volunteers in Missouri, and that would lead to more forest dedications in Missouri. So that's one way that people can help.
So we're almost out of time, but I want to ask you one more question about the succession from second growth to old growth. And that's, you talked about a greater variety of species, of tree species especially, but can you talk just briefly a bit more about, I know that there are miraculous stories all over the world about when you let a forest return, insects or birds or mammals or amphibians that might not have been seen there for 50 years. Suddenly they show up. Can you tell a story like that to end with? A story or two.
Right. I don't have an exact story, but you reminded me to I never mentioned my third book, which is called Nature's Temples. And it's called Nature's Temples, The Complex World of Old Growth Forests. And that's where I tell those stories where I compare the second growth forest to the old growth forest. And in a nutshell, because we don't have much time, I know, in an old growth forest, there will be greater carbon sequestration. In an old growth forest, there will be more moss species, and partly because the bark is thicker on those trees and holds more moisture. In the old growth forest, there will be snail species that are only found in the old growth forest. There will be more mushroom species. There will be more salamander species and higher numbers. So no matter what we measure, that measurement increases as the forest gets older. And how does that happen? You know, where do those things come from? We don't even really know. But it shows the power of nature and the resiliency. You know, she wants to heal, and we should let her.
Well, thank you so much for all of that, and I would like to thank listeners for listening. My guest today has been Joan Maloof. This is Derrick Jensen for Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network.